Hi everyone, today I'm going to teach you guys how to make this bustier halter top with a collar. When I designed this top, I was really inspired by vintage fashion, but I also wanted to create something that can transition easily from the summer into the fall. And if you like crop tops, this is like a unique addition to your closet. I do encourage you guys to sample first on muslin or a sample piece of fabric, just so you guys can get used to the sewing of the curves in this pattern. I chose to use this beautiful rose print fabric that is 100% cotton because it reminded me of a Dior print. Taking both pieces of the collar with right sides together, we're going to sew all around the edge, pivoting at those corners 3/8 of an inch all the way around. Then we're going to clip those corners just so that there's no fabric bulk when we do turn it inside out, as well as snip along the curve to help it lay better. I chose to use a screwdriver to push from the inside out and then used a pin to really pull out my corners so it's nice and pointy. These were just tools I had sitting beside my sewing machine. Once you press it out, it should look like this. Next, we are going to move on to the bra pieces of our pattern. We're going to do the center front as well as the bottom bust. Make sure you notched it at the correct size line, because we are going to be taking those pieces and lining it up at the notch with right sides together. I want to pin it at where we have notched it just so that it stays in place, and I actually like to sew starting from that notch point to make sure it just lines up properly. I personally know I'm not the best fabric cutter, so it may not line up perfectly for me, and I may have a little bit extra on the ends of one of my pieces, and that'll be totally okay as long as it's not too much, because 3/8 seam allowance will accommodate it. Curves are the trickiest things to sew, so take your time sewing these pieces together and make sure you keep your stitching as even as possible and maintaining that seam allowance 3/8 of an inch away from the edge as you sew. And you're actually going to do this 4 times. 2 times for your facing and then 2 times for your lining. I didn't film myself sewing the lining at all, but I feel like you guys get the point. And then once you are done sewing that seam, we're actually going to clip that curve to give it that ease for when you press it out so that curve can be flat. I top stitched down the seam allowance on either side of that seam 1/8 of an inch away. I also provided a nice little detail for the bra part. And here's how that turned out. You're going to do this again for both your facing pieces and your lining pieces. Now that you have your top and bottom bust sewn together, we're going to move on to the center front part of the halter. We are going to grab that and make sure again you notch it at the size line that you needed it at, and we're going to line up that seam that you just sewed to that notch. It is a curve, so go again nice and slow when you're sewing this on the sewing machine. And I again started at the notch, sewing outwards from the notch just to make sure again that it did line up properly. It's okay if it's slightly off. The seam allowance should accommodate for it, since your cutting may not be perfect. But I'm only talking like a millimeter or 2, not an inch. I didn't speed this part up at all because I want you guys to see even an experienced sewer like me is sewing pretty slow around this curve, just because I wanted again to be nice and even. I'm sewing 3/8 of an inch away from the edge, making sure I pull out my pins before I sew. I know sometimes it's easier just to sew straight over those pins, but your machine will thank you for not sewing over them. You should have done this for both the facing pieces and your lining pieces. So total there will be 4 pieces. And then we're going to clip the seam allowance of that curve all the way to the seam as close as possible without actually snipping the seam. We're going to press that seam allowance towards the center front. So we're going to take those side back pieces and sew it to the front pieces at the side seam. Again, 3/8 of an inch is your seam allowance. You're going to sew that back piece to the front piece with right sides together. Next, we're going to join the front pieces together at the neck, right sides together, and sewing in 3/8 of an inch. When you're done sewing that, you're going to press your neck seams open and then the side seams towards the center back. We're halfway there, guys, so congratulations if you made it this far. I swear you guys can finish this in one sitting. Next, we're going to line the collar up to the facing of the front of the top. We're going to take the midpoint of that collar and line it up to that neck seam that we just sewed. You already know that I like to sew starting from the notch, so I'll start at the notch and sew my way out on either side of this collar. And I'm actually just going to do it 1/8 of an inch away because I'm just doing it to hold the collar into place for now. Now we're going to take your lining piece and put it right side together with the facing, and we're going to sew that inner curve first. If needed, you should pin all the seams together just to make sure that the seams do line up between the facing and the lining. And then we're going to open that curve up and top stitch the seam allowance away from the facing towards the lining. This is where it's going to get a little tricky because now we want to sew the outside curve, but in order to do that we have to fold the collar in half just so that we don't accidentally sew over the collar. So we're going to kind of force the collar to fit in that channel just for now, so definitely pin this part. Then we're going to top stitch that seam allowance towards the lining again, and you're not going to be able to go that far. I only was able to go to the bust seam because that channel gets so narrow you can't really sew much further than that. It's totally okay because the whole purpose of this top stitching the seam allowance is just to prevent the lining from rolling over towards the facing, because you know how sometimes on poorly made clothes the lining seems to come out from the top and shows from the outside. This just helps prevent that. Now with right sides together, we're going to sew the bottom of the bra top. Because you see that really tiny hole at the ends, we're going to somehow turn this entire thing inside out. So again, we're going to go right sides together and sew together the bottom of the bra top. Sewing is just really engineering and trying to figure out how all these pieces go together and making it look as nice as possible. We really have to take the time to appreciate that we take nothing, like it's literally flat 2D, and we make it into something wearable. Once you finish sewing the bottom of the top together, we're going to try to flip it inside out now. I'm using a pair of needle nose pliers. It's flat at the edge so it doesn't really pull at the fabric, and I'm going to use it to help me turn this entire thing right side out. Definitely lost a fingernail doing it. Like, it's going to require some strength. Hopefully you guys didn't accidentally sew over your collar, otherwise it should turn out nicely. Take a moment to appreciate how clean this all looks with the lining. Like, you did that. Oh, this is one of two ways to finish it. This is if you want a front closure on this top. We're going to close up the center back by folding in one of the sides half an inch so that we can tuck the other side in also half an inch and just straight stitch sewing it down together. Now for the front, we're going to take one of those big hook and loop and use that as a closure. We often see these on trousers, but I'm going to use it to close up the front of my bra top. And then for just an added detail, I put a button on top, like one of these vintage pearl button. Another way you're going to finish this top if you want a back closure, not a front closure, is we're going to stitch together the front of the top. You're going to stitch into the ditch, into the seam, so you can't really see the stitching. And then for the back, we're going to add a tape of hook and eye. You'll need about 3 of them if you want to do them individually, but it might be easier if we do it on a strip so that it closes like a bra at the back. I ended up preferring the back closure to the front closure just so I could have more support and security than the front closure. And there you have it, a brand new top.